a cyberpunk craft that's going to absolutely amaze all of your friends at your next game session, and doubles as one of the most elaborate cell phone stands ever made. This video is packed full of cool tips, tricks, and techniques to keep even the most advanced crafter coming back for more. That's this week on Tabletop Witchcraft. Hey there, and welcome back to Tabletop Witchcraft. This week, we're going to build this epic looking piece of cyberpunk terrain that also doubles as probably one of the most elaborate cell phone stands ever made. Now, I knew way back when I got my smoke machine from Wayne's Workshop that I wanted to make this build. Had a lot of really cool opportunities to have smoke coming out of it. But I also knew that I wanted a lot of electrical components. I could handle the iPhone for the Billboard, but when it came to all the different blinking lights that are all over the craft, the LED screen that's in the front, I knew I was going to need some help. So I reached over to David at Terraintronics, and he really was able to help me figure all of this out. Now, I've collaborated with him on the video, so if you want to see how to do all of the electrical components, how to get these lights blinking, and the components that are needed to build this, head on over to his YouTube channel. I'll put a link in the description below. Also, you can win a set of plans to build along with me for this craft. All you have to do is like and comment on the video and follow me on Instagram, because that's where I'll announce the winner next week. Also, consider heading on over to Patreon and checking the tiers out over there. In the Coven, I have a Discord channel where you can actually hang out with me live while I'm making these crafts. And I actually incorporated a bunch of ideas from some of my patrons while I was crafting. Alright, if you're ready, let's go grab some supplies and let's get crafting. Alright, so to help you out with this craft, you can grab these plans. I'll put a link in the description below. You'll help support the channel, and at the same time, it'll make this video a little bit easier for you if you're going to follow along. Now, we're going to do the left and right side of this generator station, as well as the front and the back and the top. Now, on the left and right sides, we're going to mirror two pieces so they're exactly the same, except for the very top piece, we want to have it offset a little bit so it looks a little bit more interesting once we're done. So to do that, we're going to cut one section out of one solid piece of foam, and then when we're done, instead of stopping here and turning at a 90-degree angle, we're going to cut that piece straight across. That way we can offset it here in just a minute. So here we have the two side sections that we cut out. The first one is going to be one solid section, and then the next piece, as you can see right here, is going to be two pieces. And you'll see how we're going to glue this together here in just a minute. Now we're going to do the front, and it's going to be the same as the sides. We're going to have one solid piece and then two separate pieces. Now for the top, I actually had a few screw-ups in this video when I was working on it with my design. You see that small top piece right there is really small. It's going to look a little different on the plans if you pick them up. Not a big deal. Just cut those two sections out and follow along the video, and it'll go just fine once you're done. But you can see right here is where I realized that I had screwed up the plans and had to go kind of back to the drawing board. Alright, now to hold all these in place, we're going to pin these in with some toothpicks and hot glue. And when you do this, you want to make sure to dry fit these sections before you add the hot glue to make sure everything's going to line up just right. You can see I put a line there on the bottom in pen, that way I can line it up and I know that's going to be just right when I put it in place. But you got to make sure that you put the foam in the right direction, the way you did the dry fit. And obviously you want to make sure that this piece right here is at a nice 90-degree angle to the walls. Now, to avoid the issue of kind of putting this in backwards, I added some pegs here or some toothpicks in some odd areas. That way it would only go in one direction. Once we have those in place, we can then do the right side. And now we're going to add some magnets. We need the magnets because we need to be able to access the inside of this craft to add our smoke machine and all of our electronics from Terraintronics. So you can see just how strong these magnets are. It's going to hold this in place really nice, so it's not going to bulge out in any areas and look like it hasn't been glued together. Now here is my next mistake. I ended up gluing 3 sides of this top piece, and obviously you don't want to do that because we just added magnets to the back side, and here is where I realized that I just glued it all together. So I kind of freaked out for a second because the glue had started to set, but if you get to hot glue fast enough, even if it sets up a little bit, with an Alpha knife, it's still soft and you can still cut right through it. So if you take your time, follow that seam so it's still nice and straight, you can cut through that hot glue, and if you do it fast enough, you can save your craft. Alright, now that we got that off, I'm going to melt in, or burn in 2 more holes for the last 2 magnets on the top piece of this section. That smoke there is the hot glue that I'm burning through. Now you need to cut this piece out. You can use a hot wire knife like I'm using, or an Alpha knife. The cut does not have to be pretty. As you can see right there, I hit one of my toothpicks. But we need to cut this section out so that we can slide in our smoke machine once we're done. Alright, now we need some I-beams that are going to go around the entire outside of this whole craft. It's going to look really cool, and they're not hard to make. I tried a few different ways of making these to save some time, but in the end, the fastest way was just making a whole bunch of cuts. And once you get into the groove of making 2 or 3 of these, I'm going to show you a full one right here. You can see just how fast it is to make a really cool looking I-beam. I'm going to hot glue everything together. Again, I didn't want to wait for tacky glue to set up. Once you have the hot glue on there, working on a piece of parchment paper, you can use a flat clay sculpting tool to get a nice vertical alignment of the sides of that I-beam. The reason we work on parchment paper is so if you have any hot glue that squirts out of the bottom of this I-beam, it's not going to stick to it, and you can pull it right up and keep working. Alright, so now the top of this craft, I wanted to get rid of some of these seams, so I cut on the Proxxon some very thin sheets of XPS foam. That's probably about maybe a 1/16 of an inch thick. It's really, really thin, and we're going to cover up those side seams with some of those I-beams in a minute. A cool tip is to keep your hot glue gun off. Turn it on, and the second the glue just starts coming out, that's when you can put this foam on and use it. It's going to keep the glue nice and cool so you won't burn through foam, even as thin as that I just showed you right there. Okay, so grabbing our plans, we can now start working on the Billboard section of the craft. I cut the 2 sides off because we want to be able to slide our iPhone in from one side and push it out from the other, and it just looks really cool by reducing the perimeter of those pieces on the end. Adds a little bit more character. So this is where, for this build, a Proxxon is really going to come in handy because we're going to want to shave this thin little section off right here on the front of the Billboard. Once we have that off, we can cut this piece out on the stencil, and we're going to want to cut the inner portion of that rectangular shape out. That's going to be a little bit smaller than my iPhone. I think it's an iPhone 7. Nobody make fun of me. But if you have a bigger iPhone, you can still use these plans. Just adjust accordingly for the shape of your screen or the size of your screen. Now once we have the stencil out there, we can cut this piece out. I swapped out to a brand new X-Acto blade. I wanted a nice crisp edge around the Billboard. Then we can move, as you can see right there, to the next size rectangular shape. This is going to be the inside portion that we're going to cut out. That's going to be the actual width of our iPhone or our smartphone, so we can slide it right in. Now using that really sharp X-Acto knife, we can score out the perimeter and some small sections on the inside. And instead of using a clay sculpting tool to just rough and pop those sections out, I went and used this Alpha knife and just took some nice slices across the foam so that I can have a nice flat bottom to slide the smartphone into. Now this is sort of like a little safety feature that I'm cutting into this right here. This is just wide enough to stick a pencil into. We want that so that if the iPhone goes in and you can't slide it out by pushing the screen, you can just use a pencil to pop it right out. And again, both these sides are going to be covered up by the little piece of rectangular foam that we cut out just a few minutes ago. Now this little section, we're going to cut a channel out. This is where we're going to hide a piece of tubing that's going to allow smoke to come out from our smoke machine that we're going to hide inside that little generator. So on the front piece, we cut, obviously you can see that little piece out right there. Now we're going to gouge out that channel on the bottom. Alright, so once this is all set, I took a piece of copper pipe. This was a 3/4 inch piece, and it was a little big for the billboard, but I used that to mark out the diameter that I needed, and I was able to go with PVC in just a few minutes and kind of sand it down to get that to fit in real nice. Now what's a Cyberpunk build, right, without a ton of lights? So everywhere I could fit lights, that's what I did. This is going to act as like a little indicating light for an airplane or whatever flying around that something's sticking up in the air. And the way I wired up this entire build is that if any of these LEDs go out or you have any issues, you're able to pull slack or access all the lights so that you can fix them. That way you don't spend 2 or 3 weeks working on something and a year from now something stops working. You can always go back and replace it. Now we just cut out a little bit of granny grating to cover up that section right there that the tube's going to go into. And as you can see, here's where I went with that PVC pipe. I'm just marking out some lengths and we're going to cut them to fit. Now we need to drill some holes because this is where we're going to add, in my opinion, some of the coolest lights in this build, these little tube lights. Once we have those holes cut out, we can take a little bit of solder and solder on this small gauge wire onto each end of the tube. Alright, now pulling these through, we want to make sure we have plenty of slack in that line because we're going to pull these lights out probably halfway when we're working on things, when we're painting it, to get them out of the way. Plus we want to have a lot of slack inside that substation building. That way we can always work on it and have some to work on in the future if there's an issue. Now this is a really thick piece of cardboard tubing. It's made for a set of plans. Believe it or not, this was the quickest, easiest way to cut through it. It's going to act as a sonotube or a form for our concrete that's going to hold our billboard posts upright. Now once we have the tubes in place, the wiring set up, we can then go ahead and glue this top piece right on. Now here's where I ran into yet another issue. The Hearst Arts pieces were really thin and I kept pushing way too hard on this drill bit. I wanted to drill through because I was going to fit my tubing for the smoke machine through it, and it turned out where the best thing to do was go with a little bit thicker piece of a Hearst Arts cast and just let the weight of the drill push down into it. It took a few minutes, but I finally got it and was able to get this tube in there. Okay, so we're gonna add a bunch of different cool Hearst Arts pieces to this. This is gonna be a fan that I don't have a light and smoke blowing out of. So this little hole right here that I'm putting into it now is gonna be for the tube for the smoke. And this piece is what's gonna go in front of it. Now I wanted smoke to be able to come out around each of those fan blades. But I also needed the fan to be in place there, and with the hole cut out in the back, there was nothing to glue it to. So I took a piece of clear packaging from a toy, cut it out so that you couldn't see it behind those fan blades, and glued it in place. That gave me the openings for the smoke to come out around each blade, and you never know how that fan blade was actually held in place. Okay, now all I did was do a little cut around all of this to recess it, maybe 1/8 of an inch into the craft. Now you can see the fittings for the smoke machine actually take a bendy straw really well as tubing, and I needed to have a really sharp turn to get the smoke to come out on this section, and that black tubing is way too rigid, so I went with a bendy straw and those things worked awesome. As you can see in a few minutes, it's actually going to save the craft. Now these fittings actually have holes on the bottom, and I was able to run some copper wire through those, and look how secure that is. That way when I need to take the smoke machine off, I'm not going to rip or tear anything. This is a flickering blue LED we're going to have behind the fan, and pay no attention to the fact that I did a really nice rust looking job for the base coat of this, because I ended up coating it in chipping medium, and I wanted to do some nice chipping effects, and I ended up doing way too many coats of paint and washes and dry brushing, where the chipping medium it just didn't really work anymore. So I had to go a different route with my rust effect, which you'll see here in just a few minutes. Alright, now for the top of this, I used a piece of dollar store foam core because I was really pushing my height limit with the top of this little substation and the bottom of the billboard. And finally, we can get to adding the I-beams around the entire craft and a few more Hearst Arts pieces to match the I-beams really well. Now, around the perimeter or the base of the substation, it was just way too monotone, one color. So I decided to grab my Shifting Lands brick roller, and I made some really nice brick pattern, going with some dark maroon all the way up to like a blood red. And you're gonna see here in a minute just how awesome that's gonna come out. And for these Hearst Arts pieces, I tried painting with a paintbrush, but you could really see the streaks on it. I didn't like it. So I just broke out the airbrush. I used some Vallejo Air paint and painted up the metallic pieces and the yellow, and they came out really, really nice. Alright, now I had to do a little homage to Terraintronics for the collaboration between the two of us, and I wanted to go with a kind of like a little Miami vibe to this. It's really, like the cyberpunk theme itself. So I went with some Warlock purple, some pink, and like an off-white color. And I just kept blending those together until I had a really nice gradient. And then I used a green paint to go around the whole outside of that. Then with a paintbrush, I added a few drips, and this tag on the back of the billboard was all set and ready to go. Alright, now with the advice of Chad from Televised Carnage, I had to go and add some grout in between all those bricks. I'm using some patch and paint, a little bit of baking soda, and some sand to give it some texture. And as you can see in the background, I've got one done already, and I totally screwed up because I rushed it and I ended up smearing the paint and the grout turned red. So I just hit it with some Krylon matte finish, sealed the paint in, and then I was able to go back in with my finger, rub that grout on there, and then clean off the excess with a wet paper towel, and it looked totally awesome. Then to work in layers, right, the top of that brick, it needed something, so I added a nice little concrete ledge over the top of that. Alright, I knew I wanted to add a flickering sub panel off to the side of this thing that looked like it was sparking. In order to do that, I had to add a couple of different LEDs. I added a white, a flickering warm white, and a red. Then I covered them up in a bunch of dummy wires, as you can see right there, and then glued this patch panel door right onto the side. Once that was in place, I could then trim it out with some of these I-beams, and that's what I trimmed everything out with on this build. This patch panel, the door, and so on. Alright, now we can go and add in the rest of our Hearst Arts molds. This fan, I glued in the pieces on the side as well for the tubing. Now, I knew that I had the top of the billboard tagged with some spray paint, and I needed a way to get to the top. In order to do that, I just took a clay sculpting tool and some wire. I wrapped it around the clay sculpting tool, used a drill bit to punch some of these holes in there, and glue these right into place. So finally we can get to adding some of these Hearst Arts molds to the billboard. I wanted to have some yellow, a nice contrast to the black metallic color of the billboard. So I glued these right on there. and the dimensions of them happen to fit absolutely perfect on the billboard. Now I obviously needed a sort of a catwalk for people to stand on for tagging this thing, and I made that out of some granite grating and some barbecue skewers. Alright, now for the base, I wanted to make a asphalt section. Originally it was going to be more of an organic piece, but at the suggestion of some of my patrons, they said, yeah, make it asphalt. So that's what I decided to go here. I'm just gluing some dollar store foam core onto some MDF board. Now you can see all the guts on the inside of this thing that have to get shoved in there, and I had to make this custom little piece out of all these straws to make the smoke go from the smoke machine to that T-fitting that you saw earlier. Now we gotta go and glue our base to the sonotubes and the post for the billboard. Check right here, you can see that I'm not hot gluing near those wires. I left enough slack, again, so that if there's any issue in the future, we can go back to this and pull more slack through and fix the lights. Now using this little tool here, it's probably used in almost every one of my videos. It's used to, add some texture to these little pieces of foam. They're gonna act as granite slabs around the asphalt base. Now, I work construction for a living, and you always see tons of potholes, and asphalt is just, destroyed up here where I live in Maine. It's freezing, tons of potholes, cracks, and everything. So that's what I'm adding all around this base. These are the colors that I used. I went with black and that blue color as my base, and then I slowly dry brushed from darker to light with these gray colors. Now you can see I'm really dry brushing very lightly, sporadically around this base. I didn't want to have it look uniform because asphalt really is a never uniform color. You've got some areas that are dark, some areas that are lighter. Now we can finally start gluing all of these granite slabs into place. And obviously you want to dry fit all these before you put them in. And then if you look at granite curbing, it almost has like this oxidized look of color around it. So that's why I went with this burnt sienna, just to dab a little paint on there to vary up that color. And finally, we can glue this whole piece right into place on the base. You want to make sure that the sign is pretty square over the top of that substation, and you want to dry fit everything obviously before you add the hot glue. Now I didn't want to shove a bunch of sand into these bases to kind of sturdy them up before. It would have made this thing really heavy, so I just filled it with some aluminum foil, then went to the big boy hot glue gun and just filled in around the top of the foil, being careful not to get it on the wire down below for all of these string lights or tube lights. Now we can finally start pulling the wiring through into the substation for that airport light that we have up above. And you can see at each side of this landing, I've got a sharp piece of a barbecue skewer that I'm using just to hot glue it right into the billboard. Now this corner needed a little something. I had a little catch basin cover that Terraintronics had sent me, and I figured, what the heck, let's throw it in there, and it looked really awesome. It filled that corner out real nice. And finally, we got to our black wash. I put a black wash around this entire build, everything except for the brickwork. There I used the brown wash. And it's really when you get the wash on there, and then you can finally start dry brushing and layering up and adding all those details, that the build finally starts to come together. Now using some Vallejo rough gray pumice, I'm using that as my concrete that's going to be filled into these sonotubes, and I'm just using some barbecue skewers and some toothpicks and stuff to kind of get it in there real rough. I didn't want to have it a nice smooth top. Now these sonotubes, they're actually made out of like cardboard, and sometimes they're just left in place. That's how I wanted this to look. So the base would obviously have like this black mold growing up from it. And then to feather it up, I just would take a little bit of water and drag that further up the top. Okay, so for our rust effect over this brownish red paint job on the I-beams, I used this burnt sienna, and it really added a nice, really oxidized rust look to that. I made sure to do that around the entire craft a couple of times to prep it for the pigment powders that we're going to add in just a few minutes. Okay, so you might be saying, why the heck are you showing us going through your trash? Well, that's because I'm going to make some trash bags again that was made at the recommendation of some patrons that were watching along the video while I was making it. And I'm going to make some trash bags that are going to get piled up in the corner of this build. To do that, I'm going to take a glove that I use for when I'm painting, cut one of the fingers off, and then I'm literally going to take just the trash from my trash bin that I used to make this. Some foam, popsicle sticks, a straw. You can see even get some tape in there. Cut it to scale, then you can just shove it into the fingertips of the glove. Then tie it up, use a little piece of cooking twine that I painted brown as some rope, and you get a perfectly looking to scale trash bag. And I made about 5 or 6 of these that I'm going to just shove in the corner with some trash cans that, believe it or not, I got from Vallejo. Now I wanted some grime coming out of where all these cables and wires were coming from, some nice rust effect. I used some Reichland Flesh Shade wash mixed with a little bit of brown paint and some typhus corrosion, and I thought that came out really nice. I made sure to do that around all the metallic pieces that were touching the generator substation. Alright, so for our rust effect, I went with some typhus corrosion and then a dry brush of Rise of Rust. On top of that, I used a little bit of light rust pigment powder and some pigment fixer to lock it in place. Then, at the suggestion of one of my patrons who was watching live while I was building this, Televised Carnage, Chad over there, he suggested using some of these little posters, so he sent this file to me. And, you know, I know that some of these probably don't fit in the Cyberpunk era, right? Because of when these movies came out, but hey, look, these are awesome little movies. The posters look killer on there, so I had to go with it. I wanted to rip a few. I used a little bit of Eileen's tacky glue to fold some of these to make it look like the wind was blowing some of them around. And then for this one little piece that I ripped off, I figured, why not? Let's throw it right on the ground. Next, we're going to hit this up with a little dry brush on the top edges of all of the granite curb, and it really makes them stand out and pop. And then I also used the same paint to do a little dry brush around the asphalt as well. And you don't want to do, again, all of the asphalt. Just do select areas. It's going to give it a little bit more character and detail than having the entire thing look uniform. Alright, then a little homage here to Televised Carnage with all of his cool little tips and tricks. I threw that logo on there to make it look like it was tagged by somebody. And we're going to do a few more of those around the build here in just a minute. Now, we had to dirty up the yellow up here. I did hit it with a wash and I dry brushed it with some yellow, but I took some pigment powder and just let it fall down over all the areas where it would build up, hit it with some of that pigment fixer, and it really gave a nice, cool, nasty kind of, grunge effect. It looked really awesome when it all dried. Okay, now I grabbed a bunch of strands of this, I think it's 30 gauge wire that I had kicking around, and I used that to kind of camouflage the one set of wires that is actually a working set in there, and thought it looked pretty cool. Then I grabbed a few more wires, had them sticking out of this patch panel that's going to be sparking on us here in just a few minutes. Alright, now this might look really intimidating, lots of wires, but it really isn't that bad. Again, make sure you check out Terraintronics at the end of this video to see how you can set this up, and he does a really good step-by-step tutorial on all of it. Now once all of those are in place on all those little connectors, a little bit of hot glue is going to hold all those in place, and it's going to allow you to move it around without having to worry about pulling all those off down the road. Okay, now you can see I'm inserting this funky little tube that I made. And again, it was a fun problem-solving time trying to come up with that. And you can see the inside of that thing is pretty realistic, because in the inside of all these generator stations, stuff like that, it always is crammed with a ridiculous amount of wires and cables. Alright, now we finally get to add our trash pile in the corner. Those trash cans were actually from Vallejo, believe it or not. And one of these I wanted knocked over, and it did not look good, obviously, with the trash, vertical in that. So I just took a little bit of green stuff, rolled it into a ball, and shaped it to look like trash rolling out. Using this cool side of one of these clay sculpting tools that I actually never used before, I used it to put a bunch of dimples into the trash, and it looked really awesome. Filling it with some small rocks, a little piece of wire, and a piece of cardboard really made it look like some trash had spilled out. Now I rusted up the lid, and as you can see on the right side there's a couple of crows in that one trash can. I'm going to stick one here, and I put a few more around the trash as well to make it look like they were swarming it, and it really is a cool little section of this craft to check out. Alright, now we need a little bit of grass growing up from some of these cracks. All the grass that I put on this was only one small little grass tuft. That's all. You don't need a lot. Rip that one tuft into a bunch of small little sections, put them in some of the cracks, put them by some of the granite curb, and it's just enough greenery to make it look pretty cool. Okay, so now I mentioned earlier that I wanted to use the Vallejo chipping medium, but I had too many layers of things on here, paint, washes, and all that stuff. So I had to go this route. And it's just a little sponge that I mixed those two colors in the background. It's a black red and a dark brown to add a rust look showing through this metal. And just dabbing it on there, doing some streaks, dragging it down onto, towards the ground. And then in the very center, I used some medium rust, as you can see right there. And I'm going to hit that up with some pigment fixer. Once the pigment fixer was on there, I went to some light rust, and I put a little dab of that in the center of each one of those. Leaving it chunky looking kind of gave it a three-dimensional look where the rust really was starting to corrode and come up through that painted surface over the metal on this substation. Now I had to do some more tagging around the entire thing. I didn't show all of it here, but I did a little AGL on one side in pink, and I did an AJL on the other side. These are my kids' initials, so I had to toss them in there, and I thought that was kind of neat. And I'm using Vallejo Air for the paint on those. Now what's a cyberpunk build, right, without water? Whenever you think cyberpunk, you always think rainy nightscapes, right? So I'm going with some Vallejo water texture. I'm going to fill all these cracks. I'm going to press with my finger into the asphalt or the foam here with my finger. Fill those with some water texture. And I even put some around the top of the generator station and on top of those sonotube concrete sections as well. Alright, so if you're in love with the dystopian futuristic world that's Cyberpunk, or if you're just after one of the most elaborate cell phone stands ever made, then I hope you really enjoyed this video. Now I made a lot of mistakes, and there were some really hard times building this, trying to figure certain things out. And working with David really was a very eye-opening experience when it came to all the electrical stuff, and my confidence has really increased tremendously since the start of this build. So I just want to thank David again for all his help. Again, his link will be in the description below to Terraintronics. Make sure to check his stuff out for all the behind-the-scenes programming and technical stuff for this build. Now, you might have seen the little subscribe animation that I had in this video. That was made for me by Leaf over at Devs and Dice. I wanted to give him a quick shout out and thank you. Make sure to check his YouTube channel out as well. Also, if you want to win the set of plans, just leave a like and a comment in this video and follow me on Instagram. Again, I'll mention that winner next week on my story. Also, if you want to hang out with me live, right here while I'm building this stuff and give me some tips that you might want to see added to some of my builds, or just tell me what you're working on and hang out, join me over on Patreon. The Coven tier or higher will gain access to that, and we can hang out while I'm working on all these crafts. Now, a quick little sneak peek. I got another epic build that is going to be one of the biggest things I have ever worked on the channel. It's going to be coming out in a few months. I'm still lining up a lot of companies that want to help contribute, some other people that might want to help out with the channel. So I'm really, really excited. Again, it's going to be one of my biggest undertakings ever on this channel. All right, so make sure to like and subscribe so you don't miss out on that. And until next time, I'll see you around.